What if the gods who created us had a weakness they could never escape? A dependency that made them vulnerable despite all their power. Tonight we explore a mystery hidden in the oldest texts, a secret about divine hunger that shaped everything that followed in human history. The Anunnaki needed to eat, not symbolically, not ritually, physically. They required a substance to survive, and without it, they would die. The food of life, the bread of heaven, a sustenance that could not be found on earth, a problem that had no easy solution across the cosmos. Why couldn't beings who crossed the vast distances between stars simply grow their own food? What made this substance utterly irreplaceable? The answer reveals why we exist, what we were created to do, why everything in human history unfolded exactly as it did from the beginning. Let your breath slow. Let the noise of modern life fade completely. Tonight, we trace the path of divine hunger to its unsettling conclusions. This is a story rarely told in any tradition, a dependency never discussed openly, a weakness the gods themselves tried to hide from human memory. Settle in and let go of the day's concerns. The night is long, and the mystery of what the gods needed runs deeper than any temple or tomb. Before there were pyramids, before there were kings, there was a crisis unfolding in heaven. The gods were running out of what they needed to survive. What happened next shaped absolutely everything. Human creation, the structure of civilization, the religions we still practice and follow today. This is the Anunnaki food of life problem, the divine dependency that determined our very existence, our purpose, and our relationship to the cosmos. In the ancient Sumerian texts, the gods are not the abstract, omnipotent beings of later religions. They are physical entities with physical needs. They grow tired and require rest. They experience hunger and thirst. Most importantly, they need specific sustenance to maintain their extraordinary lifespans and capabilities. The texts speak repeatedly of divine food and divine drink, substances that separated the gods from mortals as surely as their knowledge or their power. Without these substances, even the mightiest of the Anunnaki would weaken, age, and eventually perish. The Sumerians called it the bread of life and the water of life. These were not metaphors for spiritual nourishment, but references to actual substances that the gods consumed to survive. Temple rituals centered on providing these offerings to divine statues, a practice that continued for millennia across Mesopotamian civilizations. The priests who prepared these offerings followed precise recipes handed down through generations, suggesting that the preparation itself held significance beyond mere symbolism. Something real was being provided, something the gods genuinely required to maintain their existence. The question that emerges from careful reading of these texts is troubling in its implications. If the Anunnaki were so powerful, so advanced, so capable of crossing the vast distances between worlds, why could they not simply produce their own food? What made this substance so special that it could not be synthesized, grown, or manufactured anywhere on Earth? The texts hint at answers, but never state them directly, as if even the scribes who recorded these stories did not fully understand the science behind divine nutrition. Consider the implications of a race of beings dependent on a substance they cannot locally produce. Every supply must be brought from elsewhere. Every shortage creates crisis. Every interruption in the supply chain threatens not just comfort, but survival itself. This is not the picture of omnipotent gods, but of colonists far from home, maintaining tenuous connections to resources they desperately need. The Anunnaki, for all their power, may have been far more vulnerable than the humans who worshipped them ever suspected. The dependency would have shaped everything about the Anunnaki presence on Earth. Their choice of locations, their relationships with each other, their treatment of the humans they created, all would have been influenced by the constant need to secure and maintain supplies of the food of life. Every decision would have been made in the shadow of this vulnerability. Every plan would have included provisions for a substance that could not be taken for granted, no matter how powerful the beings who required it. The myth of Adapa provides our clearest window into the food of life mystery. Adapa was a sage of Eridu, created by the god Ea to serve as a priest and advisor to human communities. He was granted extraordinary wisdom, knowledge of the arts and sciences, and the ability to communicate with the gods. But he was not granted immortality. That limitation would become central to one of the most revealing stories in Sumerian mythology, a story about what happened when a human came face to face with the opportunity to become divine. When circumstances brought Adapa before Anu, the supreme god in heaven, he was offered the bread and water of life. Ea had warned Adapa not to accept food or drink from Anu, claiming it would be the bread and water of death rather than life. Trusting his creator, Adapa refused the offering. Only after the refusal did Anu reveal the truth. By refusing the food of life, Adapa had lost the chance for immortality, both for himself and potentially for all humanity. The decision could not be undone. The clay tablets from Nippur contain some of the most detailed descriptions of divine food preparation, with specific ingredients listed that scholars have struggled to identify. The standard interpretation treats this myth as an explanation for human mortality, similar to the Genesis story of forbidden fruit bringing death into the world. But a closer reading reveals layers of complexity that simple morality tales do not usually contain. Why would Anu, the supreme deity, offer immortality to a human servant? Why would Ea, who created Adapa and presumably cared for him, deceive his own creation to prevent that gift? The tension between these two gods suggests competing agendas regarding humanity's status and potential. The implication is staggering in its possibilities. If eating the bread and water of life could transform a mortal human into an immortal being, then the substance was not merely nutritious, but transformative at a fundamental biological level. It did not simply sustain life, but altered the very nature of the being who consumed it. This suggests biochemistry or technology far beyond anything we would recognize as food, a substance capable of rewriting the biological destiny of whoever ingested it, switching mortality off like a genetic switch being flipped. Ea's deception becomes more understandable when we consider what was truly at stake. If humans could achieve immortality simply by consuming the food of life, the entire power structure between gods and mortals would collapse immediately. The gods would lose their workforce, their worshippers, their reason for creating humanity in the first place. Keeping humans mortal was not cruelty, but necessity for maintaining the cosmic order the gods depended upon. The food of life was a secret that had to be guarded absolutely, a resource that could never be shared, no matter what individual gods might have wished. What was this food of life that the gods required? The texts describe it in terms that suggest both plant and mineral origins, as if the substance combined organic and inorganic elements in ways we do not fully understand. Some references speak of it growing in gardens accessible only to gods, tended by divine gardeners who cultivated it according to methods never revealed to mortals. Other references describe the substance as extracted, processed, and refined through procedures that sound more industrial than agricultural. The water of life is sometimes associated with specific springs or sources, waters that flowed in divine realms and carried properties that ordinary water did not possess. The bread of life required preparation according to methods known only to divine bakers, recipes guarded as carefully as any secret of the gods. The substance was not single and simple, but compound and complex, perhaps requiring multiple ingredients combined in specific proportions and processed through particular methods to achieve its life-sustaining properties. Modern researchers have proposed various interpretations of what the food of life might have been. Some suggest it was a pharmaceutical compound, perhaps a hormone or enzyme that the Anunnaki bodies required but could not synthesize internally. Others propose it was a form of energy or radiation that had to be consumed in material form to be absorbed by their biology. Still others suggest a nanotechnology that maintained cellular repair at levels impossible for natural biological processes. Tiny machines that had to be replenished through consumption. The most intriguing possibility connects the food of life to the monoatomic gold that some researchers believe the Anunnaki came to Earth to mine. Gold, in certain atomic states, exhibits unusual properties that mainstream science has not fully explored, properties that some claim include effects on biological systems. Ancient alchemists pursued the philosopher's stone, a substance that would grant immortality and perfect health. Egyptian pharaohs consumed white powder from temple laboratories whose composition remains debated to this day. The pattern of a transformative mineral substance appears across cultures and eras, perhaps all echoing an original truth about what the gods required to survive and maintain their extraordinary state. The Hebrew manna, the Hindu soma, the Greek ambrosia, all may represent cultural memories of the same essential substance, filtered through different traditions and transformed by centuries of mythological elaboration. The consistency of the pattern suggests something real behind the various myths, something that actually existed and was consumed. If the food of life was indeed a processed form of gold, or a substance derived from gold, the entire Anunnaki presence on Earth takes on new meaning that transforms our understanding of ancient history. They came not for wealth as we understand it, but for survival. The mining operations described in the texts were not economic enterprises, but existential necessities. Gold was not currency, but medicine. The elaborate processes for refining and transporting gold back to Nibiru were not about profit, but about keeping an entire civilization alive. The texts describe a crisis among the gods long before humans existed on Earth. The Anunnaki, who worked the mines grew exhausted, their labor endless, their complaints increasingly loud. They demanded relief from Enlil, the commander of the Earth mission, threatening rebellion if their situation did not change. This labor dispute is fascinating precisely because it reveals that even gods could not simply will resources into existence. Someone had to do the work. Someone had to extract the raw materials and process them into the substances that sustained divine life. The solution to this crisis was the creation of humanity. Enki, the god of wisdom and water, proposed creating a worker species that could take over the mining operations and free the Anunnaki from labor they found degrading. Using the genetic material of existing Earth primates, combined with their own divine essence, the gods created humans as laborers. We were designed to work, to extract, to process, to serve the needs of beings who could not, or would not, do the work themselves. Excavations at Uruk uncovered storage vessels bearing inscriptions that reference the preservation of sacred substances over periods measured in centuries. Our very existence was the gods' answer to their supply chain problem, the solution to a crisis that threatened the sustainability of their mission on Earth. Humanity was not created out of love or companionship or any desire to share existence with another species. We were created out of desperate, practical necessity, because the gods needed workers and could not continue without them. This origin casts all of human history in a fundamentally different light than any religious tradition has acknowledged. The orbital period of Nibiru, approximately 3,600 Earth years according to the texts, would have created enormous supply chain challenges. Ships could travel between Nibiru and Earth most efficiently during orbital approaches, when distances were shortest. Between approaches, the Anunnaki on Earth would need to maintain supplies sufficient to last for millennia. The logistics required are staggering to contemplate. Storage facilities, processing capabilities, distribution systems, all would have been essential to keeping the Earth mission viable. If the food of life could not be produced on Earth, every ounce would have to be either brought from Nibiru or manufactured from materials shipped from home. The vulnerability inherent in such an arrangement would have been a constant source of anxiety. What if a shipment failed to arrive? What if production problems on Nibiru interrupted supplies? What if the journey itself somehow spoiled or destroyed the precious cargo? The Anunnaki on Earth lived with uncertainties that their power could not eliminate. Some texts hint at attempts to cultivate divine plants on Earth, special gardens protected from mortal access, where the gods attempted to grow what they needed in this foreign environment. The Garden of Eden may represent one such attempt, a protected biosphere where conditions were maintained for plants that could not survive in the wider world. The failure of these gardens, or their destruction in cataclysms like the Great Flood, might explain the eventual withdrawal of divine presence as local supplies became impossible to maintain. The pattern of divine food appears across cultures in ways that suggest far more than coincidence or parallel invention. Greek gods consumed ambrosia and nectar, substances that conferred immortality and were absolutely forbidden to mortals under pain of severe punishment. The similarity to the Sumerian food of life is striking in both form and function. Divine beings required special substances to maintain their immortal state, and those substances had to be kept from human access at all costs. Norse mythology describes the golden apples of Idun, without which the gods would age and eventually die. When these apples were stolen, the gods began to weaken immediately, their immortality revealed as contingent rather than inherent. The apples had to be recovered or the gods would perish. This dependency on a specific substance mirrors exactly what the Sumerian texts describe, suggesting that Norse traditions preserved the same essential truth in their own cultural framework. The temple archives at Ebla mention trade routes specifically designated for transporting materials the texts describe as essential for divine sustenance. Hindu traditions speak of Amrita, the nectar of immortality that emerged when the gods and demons churned the cosmic ocean. This substance was so precious that wars were fought over its possession. It conferred not just long life, but complete immunity to death and decay. The struggle to obtain and control Amrita drives many Hindu myths, revealing how central this substance was to divine concerns. The gods were not above needing and competing for the substance that sustained them. Cylinder seals depicting feeding rituals show precise sequences of actions that priests performed, suggesting standardized procedures passed down through generations. Chinese legends describe peaches of immortality grown in celestial orchards, fruit that ripened once every thousands of years and granted eternal life to whoever consumed them. The Queen Mother of the West guarded these peaches jealously, distributing them only to worthy immortals. The pattern is consistent. Divine food exists. It is rare and precious. It is guarded carefully, and it is denied to ordinary mortals. This consistency across unconnected traditions demands explanation. The Sumerian king list's enormous reign lengths may reflect not fantasy, but the actual lifespans of beings who had access to sustenance we cannot identify. The biblical tradition preserves its own version of this pattern in the Tree of Life, which stood in the Garden of Eden alongside the more famous Tree of Knowledge. After eating from the Tree of Knowledge, Adam and Eve were expelled from the garden, specifically to prevent them from also eating from the Tree of Life and becoming immortal like the divine beings. The cherubim with flaming swords guarded the way to this tree, ensuring no human could ever access it again. Cuneiform tablets from Lagash describe specialized workshops within temple complexes dedicated to processing substances whose names we cannot translate with certainty. The fear expressed in the Genesis text is explicit and revealing. If humans gained immortality as well as knowledge, they would become like the gods themselves, a threat to the divine order. This concern exactly mirrors what the Adapa myth describes, the same anxiety about maintaining the boundary between mortal and immortal, the same determination to keep the food of life out of human reach. The parallels are too precise to ignore, suggesting common origins for traditions that later diverged. The Eridu Genesis, one of our oldest creation accounts, explicitly links divine nourishment to the establishment of the first cities in Mesopotamia. If the Anunnaki truly required a special substance to maintain their extended lifespans, what does this tell us about their biology? One possibility is that their cellular repair mechanisms depended on compounds their bodies could not synthesize from available precursors. Many Earth species require dietary intake of vitamins and minerals they cannot produce internally. Humans, for example, cannot synthesize vitamin C and will develop fatal scurvy without dietary sources. Perhaps the Anunnaki had a similar but far more extreme dependency. Another possibility involves telomeres, the protective caps on chromosomes that shorten with each cell division in most organisms. In humans, telomere shortening is directly linked to aging and eventual death. Some species maintain telomere length through enzymes like telomerase, effectively avoiding this particular mechanism of aging. Perhaps the food of life contained compounds that activated or enhanced telomerase function in Anunnaki biology, allowing indefinite cellular renewal as long as the substance was regularly consumed. The transformative effect described in the Adapa myth, where a single meal could convert a mortal to an immortal, suggests something even more profound than cellular maintenance alone could explain. If a single consumption could transform human biology permanently, the substance was altering fundamental genetic or epigenetic programming. Perhaps the food of life activated dormant genetic sequences that switched the body into a regenerative mode, essentially reprogramming the entire organism for indefinite survival. The connection to gold remains intriguing in light of modern research into monoatomic elements and their potential biological effects. Some researchers claim that gold and other heavy metals in monoatomic states exhibit unusual properties, including superconductivity and effects on biological systems. While mainstream science remains skeptical of most such claims, the persistent ancient association of gold with immortality and divine power is too consistent across cultures to dismiss without investigation. Perhaps the ancients understood something about gold's potential that we have not yet rediscovered or properly verified through our scientific methods. The alchemical pursuit of transforming base metals into gold was always linked with the pursuit of immortality. The two goals intertwined as if the alchemists understood a connection that modern chemistry has not acknowledged. The food of life may have been a gold-based compound whose properties we have not yet learned to identify or replicate. Archaeological surveys of ancient mining sites in southern Africa have revealed extraction techniques that seem disproportionately sophisticated for their supposed era. Why couldn't the Anunnaki produce the food of life on Earth? The texts suggest that certain essential ingredients simply did not exist here or could not be cultivated in Earth's environment. Just as a tropical plant cannot survive in Arctic conditions, regardless of care given, perhaps the sources of divine food required atmospheric, gravitational, or electromagnetic conditions found only on Nibiru or in other cosmic locations. Earth was suitable for mining, but not for cultivation of what the gods most needed. Another possibility is that producing the food of life required technology or infrastructure that could not be transported to or constructed on Earth with available resources. Imagine trying to manufacture a modern pharmaceutical without access to chemical plants, purified reagents, or precision equipment. If the food of life required similar levels of sophisticated processing, the Anunnaki on Earth might have been entirely dependent on regular shipments from their home world, unable to produce even small amounts locally. The depletion of easily accessible gold deposits over time may have contributed to the eventual reduction of divine presence on Earth. If the Anunnaki came primarily for gold, and the gold became harder to extract, at some point the mission would become unsustainable. The massive ancient mines in Africa, South America, and elsewhere represent extraction on scales that suggest far more than human need could ever have motivated. Perhaps we are living in the aftermath of a cosmic mining operation. The distribution of ancient gold mines follows patterns that some researchers believe align with descriptions in Sumerian texts of Anunnaki mining operations. Some traditions speak of the gods teaching humans to prepare offerings, specifically so that divine hunger could be addressed through human labor and devotion. The elaborate temple rituals may have originated not as symbolic worship, but as actual food preparation according to divine recipes. The offerings burned on altars may have been genuinely consumed rather than merely symbolic, with smoke carrying essence to beings who fed on what fire transformed. The transition from actual feeding to symbolic ritual would have happened gradually as divine presence faded, and the original purpose of the practices was forgotten by those who maintained them. The pressure to maintain food of life supplies would have created tensions among the Anunnaki that the texts only hint at through stories of divine conflict. When resources are limited and survival depends on access, even beings of great wisdom and power will compete. The rivalries between Enlil and Enki, the wars between younger gods, the betrayals and alliances that fill Mesopotamian mythology, may reflect genuine disputes over who controlled the substances that kept everyone alive. Divine politics may have been survival politics, dressed in mythological narrative. As the Anunnaki withdrew from direct involvement with humanity, knowledge of their physical nature transformed into theological abstraction. Gods who once ate and drank became purely spiritual beings who needed nothing but worship and faith. The actual food of life became symbolic communion, the sharing of bread and wine as spiritual nourishment rather than physical sustenance. The original meaning was lost layer by layer, but the rituals persisted, empty of their original content, yet still powerful. Temple offerings evolved from actual provisions into purely symbolic gestures over the centuries of divine withdrawal. Priests who once prepared real food for real gods continued their rituals before statues that never ate what was placed before them. The elaborate recipes and procedures were maintained because tradition demanded it, but the purpose had been completely forgotten. Occasionally, the text preserved confusion about this transition, with priests wondering why the gods never seemed to consume what was offered. The transformation of physical gods into spiritual beings solved a theological problem that would otherwise be awkward to explain to worshippers. If gods needed to eat, they were not truly omnipotent. If they could weaken or die, they were not eternal in the way later religions demanded. By abstracting the divine into purely spiritual existence, theologians eliminated the uncomfortable dependencies that the original texts described. The gods became perfect, complete, and self-sufficient. The Rig Veda's hymns to Soma describe preparation methods involving pressing, filtering, and mixing with specific substances that mirror Mesopotamian procedures. Yet traces of the original conception persist, even in the most spiritualized traditions. The Christian Eucharist presents bread and wine as the body and blood of Christ, consumed to gain spiritual life and communion with the divine. The concept of becoming one with God through eating echoes the Adapa myth, where consuming divine food would transform a mortal into something greater. The ritual has been spiritualized completely, but the fundamental pattern remains: consuming a special substance to transcend ordinary human limitations. The Jewish tradition preserves Shabbat meals and Passover seders as sacred eating, communal consumption that connects participants to divine covenant. The Hindu prasad, food offered to deities and then shared among worshippers, carries blessing from divine to human through the act of eating. Across traditions, sacred food retains its power, even when the original reason for that power has been completely forgotten. We continue rituals whose origins we no longer understand. Norse sagas describe Idun's apples being stored in a container called an eski, a detail too specific for purely symbolic narrative. The Anunnaki's interest in gold mining connects directly to theories about the food of life in ways that illuminate both mysteries. If divine sustenance required gold or gold-derived compounds, the massive mining operations described in the texts become completely comprehensible. Gold was not valuable for jewelry or currency in any modern sense, but essential for survival itself. The labor crisis that led to humanity's creation was not about greed or convenience, but about the desperate need to extract enough gold to sustain the Anunnaki population. Ancient texts from multiple civilizations describe processes for refining gold into forms we do not recognize today and cannot replicate with certainty. Egyptian temples contained laboratories where gold was processed in ways that the texts describe, but that we do not fully understand. The rite of the divine mouth involved substances that may have been derived from gold. The white powder of gold appears in traditions from Egypt to China to India, consistently associated with longevity, spiritual transformation, and connection to divine states. Modern gold is valued for its beauty, its electrical conductivity, and its resistance to corrosion and chemical reaction. But gold in monoatomic or colloidal forms exhibits different properties that some researchers claim include biological effects that science has not fully investigated. While mainstream academia remains skeptical of such claims, the persistence of gold in immortality traditions across every ancient culture suggests that our ancestors observed something that we have not yet properly studied. The connection between gold and the sun appears in virtually every ancient tradition, associating the metal with life force, divine energy, and immortal power. Gold was the flesh of the Egyptian sun god Ra. Gold adorned temples dedicated to solar deities worldwide. This association may not have been merely aesthetic or symbolic, but reflected actual understanding of gold's role in sustaining divine life. The sun may have been worshipped partly because it represented the source realm from which the life-giving substance originated. The depletion of easily accessible gold deposits may have been the ultimate reason for divine withdrawal from Earth. If the Anunnaki came for gold, and the gold became too difficult or expensive to extract, the Earth mission would eventually become unsustainable regardless of other factors. We may be living in the exhausted aftermath of a cosmic mining operation, on a planet that was exploited for resources we barely understand, by beings who departed when those resources could no longer justify their continued presence. If humans were created using genetic material from the Anunnaki, we may carry dormant capabilities related to the food of life that have never been activated. Perhaps our ancestors could have consumed divine sustenance and achieved extended lifespans, a potential that was deliberately suppressed through genetic manipulation or has atrophied over thousands of generations without use. The stories of antediluvian patriarchs living hundreds of years might preserve memory of a time when human biology retained more of its divine template. The consistent human drive to seek immortality may represent genetic memory of capabilities we have lost, but somehow still remember at a cellular level. From the Epic of Gilgamesh to modern life extension research, humans have never fully accepted death as final or inevitable. This refusal to accept mortality might be hardwired into our DNA, a legacy of our creation by beings for whom death was contingent rather than necessary. We seek what we were designed to have, but were denied. Greek sources describe ambrosia being served in specific vessels and consuming it in particular ways, procedural details that suggest actual practice. The pursuit of the philosopher's stone, the elixir of life, the fountain of youth across all human cultures, may represent distorted memories of the food of life that our ancestors knew existed and was achievable. Alchemists were not engaged in foolish fantasy, but in serious attempts to recover lost knowledge about substances that could transform human biology. Their failures were perhaps not inevitable, but resulted from incomplete knowledge, from trying to reconstruct a technology without understanding its underlying principles. Modern life extension research approaches the same ultimate goals from scientific rather than mythological directions. Telomerase activation, senescent cell removal, genetic modification, caloric restriction mimetics all seek to extend human lifespan beyond current limits. If we are indeed descended from beings who achieved biological immortality through specific substances, our current research might eventually rediscover what the ancients knew. The food of life may not be forever lost, but waiting to be found again. Or perhaps the lesson of the ancient texts is more cautionary than we realize. Perhaps the Anunnaki's dependency on the food of life was their great weakness, a vulnerability that ultimately led to difficulties we cannot know. Perhaps biological immortality comes with costs that make it less desirable than it appears from our mortal perspective. Perhaps death, for all its pain, serves purposes that eternity cannot fulfill. The gods may have been prisoners of their own longevity in ways we would not envy. The Anunnaki's dependency on the food of life represents a vulnerability rarely acknowledged in discussions of ancient astronauts or divine beings of any kind. We typically imagine advanced aliens or gods as self-sufficient entities, able to survive anywhere and provide for themselves in any environment. But the Sumerian texts present a starkly different picture. Beings far from home, dependent on supply lines stretching across the solar system, vulnerable to disruptions they could not easily overcome, despite their great power. This dependency may explain aspects of Anunnaki behavior that otherwise seem puzzling or contradictory. Their obsession with establishing permanent bases and temple complexes on Earth makes more sense if these facilities served as supply depots and processing centers. Their elaborate hierarchies and strict control systems make more sense if resources were too scarce to distribute freely. Their eventual withdrawal makes more sense if maintaining presence on Earth became unsustainable as supplies dwindled or supply lines failed completely. The emotional weight of such dependency should not be underestimated by those of us who have never experienced anything comparable. Imagine knowing that your survival depends on shipments from a world that is 3,600 years away in its orbit around the Sun. Imagine facing each supply ship's arrival, wondering if it will be the last. Imagine watching supplies dwindle and knowing that no amount of power or technology can create more from local resources. The psychological pressure must have been enormous. From this perspective, the creation of humanity was not simply a labor solution, but a desperate gamble for survival itself. If humans could mine enough gold to sustain food of life production, the Anunnaki mission on Earth could continue indefinitely. If not, the gods would face slow starvation far from home, with no way to return before their supplies ran out. Humanity was created as a lifeline, a last attempt to make an unsustainable situation sustainable. We were the solution to a problem of cosmic logistics. The conflicts among the gods that the texts describe in detail may have been driven fundamentally by competition for scarce resources, rather than by the personal disputes the myths seem to present. When supplies are limited, every decision about distribution becomes politically charged. Every favoritism becomes a matter of survival. Every alliance and every betrayal must be understood in the context of beings who literally could not afford to be generous, when generosity might mean their own destruction. The texts reveal that knowledge of the food of life was closely guarded, even among the gods themselves, a secret within secrets. Ea knew its composition and preparation, but kept that knowledge from others. Anu had access to supplies, but did not share freely even with his own family. The substance itself was stored in protected places, dispensed according to strict hierarchies of power and favor. Secrecy about the food of life was a tool of control, a resource whose distribution determined status and maintained order. The decision to withhold the food of life from humans was not simply about maintaining species boundaries for their own sake, but about preventing a precedent that could unravel everything. If one human could become immortal, others would demand the same. If knowledge of the substance's composition spread, attempts to obtain or produce it could not be contained. The myths consistently show humans getting close to immortality and being turned back at the last moment, as if the gods recognized how dangerous any exception would be. The sealing of the Garden of Eden, the failure of Gilgamesh's heroic quest, the deception of Adapa by his own creator, all represent boundary enforcement around the most precious secret the gods possessed. Humans could be given knowledge and skills and civilization itself, but not the key to immortality. That knowledge had to be protected absolutely, even at the cost of deceiving those who came closest to discovering it. The food of life was the line that could never be crossed, the gift that could never be given. When the gods eventually withdrew from direct presence on Earth, they apparently took their secrets with them completely. No clear instructions for producing the food of life survive in any known text. The closest we have are alchemical traditions that may preserve fragments of the original knowledge, garbled by millennia of transmission and misunderstanding. If the secret was written down anywhere, those texts have not survived, or have not been recognized for what they truly contain. Chinese alchemical texts describe elixirs of immortality using cinnabar and gold in procedures that required decades of preparation. Perhaps the secret was never written because writing itself would have been too risky. Perhaps the knowledge was transmitted only orally among the highest ranks of the divine hierarchy. Perhaps it was encoded in ways that humans could not decipher, even if we possessed the texts. The gods kept their most important secret, even as they departed, leaving us to seek immortality through our own means, forever cut off from the shortcut that would have made the search unnecessary. The Egyptian pyramid texts contain offering lists with items we cannot identify, substances whose hieroglyphic names have no clear translation. The Great Flood, described in Sumerian, Babylonian, and biblical traditions, may mark a crucial turning point in the food of life story. Before the flood, the gods lived among humans, their needs provided for through temple systems and constant human labor. After the flood, divine presence became increasingly rare, appearances becoming exceptional events rather than everyday occurrences. Something fundamental changed in the relationship between gods and mortals, and that change may have involved the food of life supply system. The flood was planned according to the texts. Enlil made the decision to destroy humanity, while Ea secretly preserved Ziusudra and his family against that decree. But destroying humanity would also have destroyed the labor force mining gold and supporting divine infrastructure. Either Enlil had secured alternative supplies for the Anunnaki, or he was willing to sacrifice the Earth mission entirely. The conflict between the gods over the flood decision may have been fundamentally about resources and survival. After the flood, the texts described the gods being drawn to the smell of burnt offerings from the survivors, hungry after the cataclysm had disrupted their supply systems completely. This striking detail suggests that the flood destroyed not just human civilization, but also the infrastructure that processed and distributed divine food. The survivors' offerings were genuinely needed, a desperate measure to sustain gods who had gambled everything on the cleansing flood and found themselves facing scarcity in its aftermath. The post-flood world saw gradual but steady withdrawal of direct divine presence, replaced by intermediaries like prophets and priests, and eventually by purely spiritual religion. This withdrawal may have been forced rather than chosen, a retreat as the systems that sustained divine life on earth became impossible to maintain. The gods did not abandon humanity out of choice, but out of necessity, returning to whatever cosmic sources could provide what Earth could no longer supply. Zoroastrian texts describe Haoma, a preparation remarkably similar to Vedic Soma, suggesting common Indo-European origins for the concept. The transition from physical gods to spiritual concepts may have been traumatic for the humans who experienced it, who remembered when the gods walked among them and shared their world. The ache of divine absence that runs through later religious traditions may preserve genuine memory of a time when the gods were present and then departed, leaving humanity alone in ways we had never been before. We have been seeking to reconnect with absent gods ever since, not knowing they left because they had to. If the Anunnaki story contains truth about divine dependency on specific substances, what implications follow for our understanding of religion, history, and the nature of life itself? The gods of ancient tradition were not all-powerful beings, but advanced travelers with vulnerabilities and needs. Their interventions in human history were driven not by cosmic benevolence or divine plan, but by practical necessity. Our creation was an act of survival for them, not love for us. The Book of Enoch describes heavenly food in terms that parallel Mesopotamian accounts, suggesting textual transmission across cultures. This perspective does not necessarily diminish the significance of spiritual traditions, but fundamentally recontextualizes their origins and meanings. The rituals that sustained gods became the rituals that gave humans meaning and community. The temples that served divine needs became centers of human civilization. The stories that explained divine requirements became the myths that structured human identity. Something real may have been transformed into something symbolic, but the transformation did not remove the value. The search for life extension and immortality continues in our era through biotechnology, pharmaceuticals, and genetic research. We are approaching from scientific directions the same goals that ancient traditions attributed to divine substances consumed by the gods. If our ancestors were correct that biological immortality is possible through specific compounds or treatments, our research may eventually validate their beliefs, even if through mechanisms they never could have imagined. The food of life may yet be found through paths the gods never anticipated. Or perhaps the lesson is different and more sobering than we expect. Perhaps the Anunnaki's dependency on the food of life was ultimately their downfall, a vulnerability that led to their withdrawal from Earth, and perhaps to greater difficulties we cannot know. Perhaps biological immortality comes with costs that make it less desirable than our mortal imaginations assume. Perhaps death, for all its grief, serves purposes that eternity cannot serve. The gods may have been prisoners of their own longevity. We continue to seek what the gods possessed, driven by the same refusal of death that may be hardwired into the DNA they gave us. Every medical advance, every life extension study, every supplement promising rejuvenation participates in the ancient quest for the food of life. We may be closer than we know to rediscovering what the Anunnaki consumed, or we may be forever barred from that knowledge by circumstances we do not understand. The quest continues regardless. Mesoamerican traditions of cacao as divine food may preserve independent memory of the same concept that Mesopotamian texts describe. As you settle deeper into the night, let this question rest gently in your awareness without demanding answer. What if the difference between gods and mortals was never about power or knowledge or spiritual enlightenment, but simply about access to a substance we have never properly identified? What if divinity was a metabolic state that could be entered or exited, depending on what you ate? What if immortality was not spiritual achievement, but biochemical condition? The Aboriginal Australian traditions of dreamtime beings requiring specific sustenance parallel ancient Near Eastern accounts with striking precision. The ancient texts suggest that the boundary between mortal and immortal was crossable, at least in theory. Adapa could have become immortal with a single meal. Gilgamesh came within reach of the plant of rejuvenation. Human kings were sometimes deified through rituals that may have originally involved more than symbolic transformation. The line between God and human was not fixed by nature, but maintained by deliberate control of access to transformative substances. The gods guarded what separated them from us. Perhaps this is why stories of divine food appear so consistently across every human culture. Not because humans independently invented the same metaphor for spiritual truths, but because humans everywhere preserved memory of a real boundary and the real substance that marked it. The gods ate something we could not access. That single distinction shaped everything. Everything else, all the worship and the service and the mythology, flowed from that one inequality between creators and created. Japanese mythology describes the food of the gods in ways that suggest transmission from continental Asian traditions with ultimately Mesopotamian roots. As sleep approaches, let the mystery of divine hunger settle into your dreaming mind without resolution. The gods needed to eat. They crossed the stars and found themselves dependent on substances they could not produce away from their home world. They created us to solve their problem, to mine the gold that kept them alive, to serve the needs they could not meet by themselves. We were their solution, their hope, their desperate answer to cosmic logistics. Recent research into telomerase activation has produced results that hint at the biological plausibility of what ancient texts describe as life extension. The temples rose and the offerings were made according to instructions handed down through generations. The gold was mined and processed and shipped across unimaginable distances of space. The gods lived among their creations, fed by the labor of those they had made. For millennia, the system worked. The supply chain held. The divine presence continued. But nothing lasts forever. Not even the arrangements of gods. Something changed, something ended, and the gods withdrew. Studies of extremophile organisms have revealed biological mechanisms that maintain cellular integrity far beyond what was previously thought possible. We remain the descendants of workers created for a purpose we no longer serve. The temples stand empty of their original inhabitants, the offerings purely symbolic, the gods distant memories transformed into abstract theology. But the hunger that drove the entire arrangement, the food of life that the gods required, that need may still exist somewhere beyond our knowing. Perhaps the gods still consume what we could never produce. Perhaps they still depend on substances we never understood. The discovery of horizontal gene transfer has opened possibilities for understanding how biological information might be transmitted between species. Let these possibilities drift through your consciousness as waking thought gives way to the strange logic of dreams. The ancient mystery has no certain answer that we can reach. We cannot know what the gods truly ate, or why they could not produce it here. We can only trace the shadows they left in texts written by those who served them. Hints and fragments of a truth that was old before human history began. The food of life remains a secret, taken by gods who left no forwarding address. Epigenetic research has shown that gene expression can be modified by environmental and dietary factors in ways that can extend lifespan significantly. The night holds many mysteries, and this is among the oldest of them all. divine beings with mortal needs, immortals dependent on specific sustenance they could not locally source, creators who made us to serve requirements we can barely imagine, let alone fulfill today. The story inverts everything we assume about the relationship between gods and humans. We fed them. We kept them alive. Without us, without our labor, they would have slowly weakened and faded far from home. The phenomenon of negligible senescence in certain species demonstrates that aging is not biologically inevitable, but can be circumvented. The temple granaries and storehouses of ancient Mesopotamia were not simply food storage for human populations, but may have originally served divine purposes that were later forgotten. The elaborate systems for receiving, cataloging, and distributing grain and other goods suggest administrative complexity beyond what purely human needs would require. Perhaps these institutions originated as supply centers for the gods, only later repurposed as the divine presence faded. Caloric restriction studies have consistently shown lifespan extension across species, suggesting dietary modification can affect fundamental aging processes. The concept of sacred meals appears in virtually every ancient religion. Meals where the boundary between human and divine briefly dissolved through the act of shared eating. These rituals may preserve memory of times when humans and gods actually ate together, when the food of life was present and its transformative power could be witnessed. As the gods withdrew, the meals became symbolic, but the power attributed to them remained. The role of sirtuins in cellular repair and longevity has revealed molecular mechanisms that might explain how dietary substances could affect lifespan. The brewing traditions of ancient Mesopotamia were among the most sophisticated in the ancient world, producing beverages according to recipes guarded by temple personnel across generations. Some of these recipes may have originated as attempts to produce the water of life locally, experiments in creating divine sustenance from earthly ingredients. The failure of these attempts would not have ended the traditions, which continued for their own pleasures. Mitochondrial function appears central to aging, and compounds that enhance mitochondrial efficiency show promise for life extension in laboratory studies. The garden traditions that appear in mythology, from Eden to the Hesperides, may all reflect memories of actual enclosed spaces where the gods attempted to cultivate what they needed far from home. These were not merely pleasant retreats, but desperate agricultural experiments, attempts to grow in alien soil the plants that sustained divine life. Their eventual failure or destruction would have forced the gods to rely ever more heavily on imports. The gut microbiome's influence on health and longevity suggests that what we consume affects us in ways far more complex than simple nutrition. The journey of the dead in Egyptian religion involved passage through gates where the deceased had to prove worthiness to continue. At certain stages, the dead were offered food and drink that would sustain them in the afterlife. This pattern suggests knowledge of the food of life, transformed into funerary ritual, the memory of divine sustenance becoming promise of eternal nourishment for worthy souls. Stem cell research has demonstrated regenerative capabilities that were previously thought impossible, hinting at latent biological potential. The mummification practices of Egypt, with their elaborate preservation of the body and provision of food offerings in the tomb, may reflect beliefs derived from Anunnaki examples. If the gods required physical bodies and physical food to survive, human hopes for afterlife would naturally imitate divine practice. We preserved our dead as we had seen the gods preserve themselves. The daily temple rituals at Karnak required 17 different types of offerings, each prepared according to specifications that filled multiple papyrus scrolls. The priesthoods of ancient temples held knowledge they did not share with ordinary worshippers, secrets of ritual and substance passed down through initiatory traditions. Some of this hidden knowledge may have concerned the food of life, formulas and procedures for preparing divine sustenance that were guarded even after the gods had departed. The mysteries of Eleusis and other initiatory traditions may preserve fragments of this knowledge. Mesopotamian temple inventories list gold quantities that seem excessive for decoration alone, suggesting functional rather than merely ornamental purposes. The universal human prohibition against eating certain foods may originate in divine restrictions that were never properly explained. If certain substances were reserved for divine consumption, humans would have been forbidden to eat them without understanding why. The taboos persisted even after their original reasons were forgotten, transformed into religious law or cultural custom. The orientation of Egyptian temples toward specific stellar risings may have served purposes related to the timing of ritual food preparation. The offerings burnt on altars across the ancient world share remarkably similar features despite the distances between cultures. The smoke rising toward heaven, the belief that gods consumed the essence while humans ate the remainder, the specific types of foods considered appropriate for offering, all suggest common origin in actual feeding of actual gods who required actual sustenance. Babylonian astronomical texts link certain celestial events to optimal times for preparing sacred substances, suggesting cosmological connection. The decline of animal sacrifice in later religious traditions may reflect recognition that the gods were no longer present to receive the offerings. If sacrifice originally fed divine beings who consumed what was offered, the absence of those beings would eventually become apparent. The shift to symbolic or spiritual interpretation preserved the ritual while acknowledging changed circumstances. The priesthood of Ptah at Memphis maintained records of divine feeding that spanned nearly 3,000 years of continuous practice. The soma of Vedic tradition was a plant-based drink that conferred divine vision and possibly longer life on those who consumed it properly. The identity of the soma plant has been lost, perhaps deliberately concealed as the tradition evolved. Some researchers have proposed various candidates, but none fully matches the descriptions in the texts. Soma may have been the Indian version of the food of life. Temple kitchens at major cult centers were larger than those of royal palaces, suggesting the scale of divine food preparation was substantial. The elaborate food laws of various religious traditions, specifying what can be eaten and how it must be prepared, may originate in divine instructions that originally had practical rather than merely symbolic purposes. If certain preparations were necessary to make food suitable for divine consumption, those preparations would have been taught and preserved even after their original purpose was forgotten. The requirement for priests to maintain ritual purity may have originated in practical concerns about contaminating sacred substances. The fasting traditions found in almost every religion may represent inversion of divine feeding, humans denying themselves food to achieve spiritual states that the gods maintained through special consumption. By emptying ourselves of ordinary food, we perhaps hoped to become vessels for something greater, to create space for the transformation that divine sustenance provided directly to the gods. Sacred lakes at Egyptian temples served purposes beyond symbolic purification, possibly related to the preparation of divine sustenance. The association of gold with solar deities across cultures may reflect knowledge that the food of life was somehow connected to solar processes or solar substances. The sun, as source of life, would naturally be associated with the source of divine life specifically. Gold, as captured sunlight, would be precious beyond mere aesthetic value, essential rather than merely beautiful. The precise measurements specified in temple construction may have served acoustic or energetic purposes related to food preparation rituals. The underground locations chosen for many ancient temples and sacred sites may have served purposes related to the food of life that we do not fully understand. Perhaps certain substances needed protection from sunlight or needed specific environmental conditions. The chthonic aspects of many ancient religions may preserve memory of practical requirements rather than purely symbolic associations with death and rebirth. The hierarchy of temple personnel included specialists in divine nutrition, whose titles appear in administrative texts, but whose functions remain unclear. The timing of festivals, according to astronomical events, may have originally served to coordinate food of life distribution with celestial cycles that affected its production or potency. The solstices and equinoxes marked not merely seasonal changes, but perhaps optimal moments for divine consumption. The calendrical precision of ancient religions may have had practical origins we have not recognized. Ancient Egyptian texts describe forms of gold we do not recognize, including white gold, black gold, and living gold, each with distinct properties. The dream traditions that appear in Mesopotamian, Egyptian, and biblical texts often involve divine communication during sleep. Perhaps the boundary between human and divine became more permeable during sleep, when ordinary consciousness was suspended. The gods may have found it easier to communicate with sleeping humans, or humans may have been more receptive to divine presence in altered states. The gold-working techniques preserved in the Leiden and Stockholm papyri include processes whose purposes modern metallurgists cannot fully explain. The concept of divine wrath, gods becoming angry and punishing humanity, may partly reflect the behavior of beings experiencing the stress of supply shortages. Hungry gods would be irritable gods. The mood swings attributed to various deities might have had physiological bases that the texts interpreted morally. When the food of life ran low, divine temperament would have suffered. Pharaonic gold contained trace elements in proportions that suggest intentional alloying rather than natural occurrence in the ore. The withdrawal of divine favor described in various traditions, periods when the gods seemed absent or hostile, may correspond to actual supply crises when the Anunnaki were too weak or distracted to maintain normal relations with humanity. The dark ages of divine silence in religious history may have been ages of divine hunger, periods when the gods could not afford to engage. The distribution of gold artifacts in elite burials suggests the metal served purposes beyond display of wealth or status. The stories of gods disguising themselves as mortals to walk among humans may preserve memory of times when weakened gods, lacking full access to the food of life, could pass for human because they had temporarily lost their divine radiance. The distinction between God and mortal may have been visible when gods were well fed, but blurred when supplies ran short. Ancient mining at Ma'd ad-Dahab in Arabia reached depths that would have required sophisticated engineering and compelling motivation. The hospitality traditions so central to ancient cultures, the sacred obligation to feed strangers, may originate in times when any stranger might be a god testing human generosity. If gods actually depended on human hospitality when away from their temples, refusing a stranger food could mean refusing a god, with potentially fatal consequences. The gold content in the Ark of the Covenant and other sacred objects may reflect functional requirements rather than mere value or beauty. The specificity of these ancient descriptions suggests first-hand observation rather than imaginative invention by later scribes. The transformation of temples from sites of divine residence to sites of divine memory happened gradually over centuries, leaving archaeological traces that we interpret without understanding the full significance. The earliest temples may have been actual divine habitations, with all the practical requirements that implies. Later temples were memorials to an absent presence. Mesopotamian texts describe gold being transformed through processes that took months or years, suggesting chemical rather than simple physical working. The prophetic traditions that emerged as direct divine presence faded may represent attempts to maintain connection with gods who were no longer physically present. Prophets spoke for gods who could no longer speak for themselves in person. The shift from direct theophany to mediated prophecy tracks the withdrawal of divine presence that the food of life shortage may have necessitated. The hoarding of gold by temple establishments far exceeded any economic utility, suggesting purposes beyond currency or trade. The development of written scripture to preserve divine words may reflect the departure of gods who had previously been available for direct consultation. Writing became necessary when the gods could no longer be asked directly. The sacredness attributed to religious texts may preserve memory of times when the gods themselves were present to explain their meanings. Ancient records of gold shipments include weights that would represent substantial fractions of known ancient gold production. Temple records from Sippar mention substances transported in sealed containers that could not be opened under penalty of death. The concept of covenant between gods and peoples, formal agreements with specific obligations on both sides, may have originated as actual contracts governing the relationship between dependent gods and the humans who fed them. The gods provided protection and wisdom in exchange for human service, including the mining and processing that produced their essential sustenance. The urgency expressed in ancient texts regarding gold procurement suggests needs beyond mere desire for precious material. The technical vocabulary used in divine feeding texts includes terms that appear nowhere else in the Sumerian lexicon. The apocalyptic traditions predicting divine return may preserve hope or fear that the gods will someday come back, their supply problems solved, to reclaim the world they left. The end times of various religions may be imaginings of what happens when the Anunnaki return from Nibiru, their food of life stores replenished, ready to resume their interrupted dominion. The Enuma Elish describes Nibiru's orbit in terms that specify relationships to other celestial bodies with mathematical precision. Ancient seals depicting divine banquets show serving vessels of distinctive shapes that do not match ordinary dinnerware. The construction of ziggurats and pyramids as mountains reaching toward heaven may have served not merely symbolic but practical purposes we have not recognized. Perhaps certain altitudes were necessary for some aspect of divine life or communication. Perhaps the gods preferred or required elevation. The effort invested in these structures suggests purposes beyond mere symbolism. Mesopotamian astronomical tablets track planetary positions with accuracy that suggests observational traditions spanning centuries. The association of certain trees with divine life, from the biblical Tree of Life to the Norse Yggdrasil to the Mesopotamian Hulupu tree, suggests that the food of life may have had botanical sources that the texts metaphorically rendered as trees. The consistent imagery across cultures may preserve memory of actual plants that no longer exist on Earth. The alignment of major temples with stellar rising points may have served practical purposes related to timing divine nourishment. The precision required for certain ritual preparations is specified to measurements far finer than other ancient recipes require. The dragon symbolism appearing across ancient cultures, often associated with treasures or sacred substances, may represent guardians of food of life sources. The dragon hoards gold and must be defeated to obtain treasure, a pattern that makes sense if gold and related substances were essential divine resources requiring protection from those who would claim them. The precession of the equinoxes was known to ancient astronomers, allowing them to track celestial cycles over extremely long periods. The mining traditions of the ancient world show remarkable sophistication for their supposed era, with deep shaft mines, extensive tunnel systems, and processing facilities appearing very early in the archaeological record. This precocious mining capability may reflect the urgency that divine need imposed on human development, technologies accelerated by necessity. The Dendera zodiac encodes astronomical information that some researchers believe dates the monument far earlier than conventionally accepted. The metallurgical advances of ancient civilizations, particularly in gold and copper working, may have been driven by divine requirements rather than purely human desires. If the gods needed refined metals for the food of life, they would have taught humans advanced techniques to achieve the necessary purity and quantity. Human metallurgy may be a gift that was actually a demand. Sumerian mathematical tablets use base 60 calculations that produce surprisingly accurate results for planetary orbital periods. The legends of divine weapons, thunderbolts and magic swords and arrows of the gods, may describe technology powered by the same substances that sustained divine life. If the food of life was a form of energy as well as nutrition, weapon systems might have tapped the same source. The terrible power of divine weapons would reflect the power of divine sustenance. The great year of precession, approximately 26,000 years, appears encoded in ancient monuments across multiple unconnected cultures. Texts describe substances that changed color, texture, or weight during preparation, suggesting chemical transformations. The recurring motif of divine ambiguity, gods who help and harm seemingly without consistent motivation, may reflect beings whose behavior varied with their nutritional state. Well-fed gods would be generous and creative. Hungry gods would be irritable and destructive. The inconsistency that troubles theological interpretation may have had physiological explanations. Ancient eclipse records from Babylon achieve accuracy that implies sustained, systematic observation over many generations. The restriction of certain knowledge to inner circles of priests mirrors modern practices for controlling sensitive technologies. The elaborate death rituals of royal tombs, with their stores of food, drink, and precious metals, may represent attempts by human kings to provide themselves with food of life for the afterlife. If the pharaohs believed they would become gods upon death, they would need the sustenance that gods required. The treasure buried with kings was not merely symbolic wealth. The cardinal orientations of ancient structures worldwide suggest coordinated astronomical knowledge that conventional history cannot explain. The secret teachings of mystery religions, available only to initiates who had proven their worth and discretion, may have included knowledge about the food of life that was too dangerous or too precious for general distribution. The initiatory process filtered out those who could not be trusted with secrets that could threaten the cosmic order. The relationship between calendar systems and agricultural cycles may have originated in divine timing requirements rather than purely human needs. Archaeological evidence suggests specialized workshops existed solely for processing materials whose purposes remain unclear. The Hermetic traditions that emerged in late antiquity, claiming to preserve ancient Egyptian wisdom, may carry genuine traces of knowledge about divine sustenance that survived the religious transformations of the ancient world. Alchemy's pursuit of the philosopher's stone may be a distorted memory of the food of life quest. Geological evidence confirms a massive flood event in the Black Sea region around 5600 BCE that may underlie flood traditions. The emphasis on timing in ritual texts, with preparations timed to celestial events, suggests more than symbolic connection. The Gnostic traditions that saw material existence as a prison and sought escape to spiritual realms may reflect disappointment at divine abandonment. If the gods had promised eternal life and then withdrew, taking their food of life with them, the material world would seem like a trap. Gnosticism may be the theology of those left behind when the gods departed. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis suggests cosmic catastrophe that could have disrupted whatever systems the texts describe. Analysis of residues in ancient vessels has revealed compounds whose biological effects remain under investigation. The connection between divine beings and specific geographic locations may reflect the distribution of resources necessary for the food of life. Certain places would have been more important than others, not for spiritual reasons, but for practical ones. The sacred geography of the ancient world may map resource locations that determined where gods could survive and thrive. Sediment cores from the Persian Gulf show dramatic environmental changes that coincide with textual accounts of divine withdrawal. The development of irrigation and agriculture in Mesopotamia, traditionally seen as the beginning of civilization, may have been accelerated by divine need. If the gods required specific crops or specific processing of agricultural products for their sustenance, they would have taught these techniques earlier than human need alone would have demanded. The end of the last ice age created conditions that would have disrupted any civilization dependent on stable supply chains. The consistency of divine food descriptions across unconnected cultures suggests transmission from a common historical source. The ziggurat, as a cosmic mountain connecting heaven and earth, may have served as a distribution point for the food of life, a central location where divine sustenance was received, stored, and allocated. The temple complexes surrounding ziggurats would have been the administrative centers for this distribution, handling the logistics of divine feeding. Ancient flood accounts consistently describe divine foreknowledge and selective preservation of knowledge, suggesting planned survival. Comparative mythology reveals structural parallels too specific to result from coincidence or universal human psychology. The persistent legend of a war in heaven, conflict among divine beings that affected the cosmos, may preserve memory of resource conflicts over the food of life. When supply is limited and survival depends on access, conflict becomes inevitable, even among beings of extraordinary power and wisdom. Divine politics may have been survival politics. The distribution of flood myths follows patterns that suggest transmission from a common source, rather than independent local floods. The transformation of physical practices into symbolic rituals follows patterns documented in other cultural transmissions. The peculiar status of priests in ancient societies, set apart from ordinary people and bound by special rules, may reflect their role as handlers of the food of life. Those who prepared and distributed divine sustenance would have needed to be trustworthy, pure, and completely dedicated to their task. The priesthood was not merely religious, but practical. Post-flood genealogies in multiple traditions show dramatically shortened lifespans, as if something essential had been lost. The persistence of gold symbolism in spiritual traditions worldwide may preserve memory of its original functional significance. The development of writing itself may have been driven by the need to track food of life supplies, distribution records, and processing procedures. The earliest clay tablets contain administrative records, inventory lists, and accounting data. Perhaps the first writing recorded not myths or prayers, but the logistics of keeping gods alive. Archaeological layers in Mesopotamia show clear flood deposits that separate distinctly different phases of civilization. Temple economies controlled resources far exceeding what purely spiritual purposes would seem to require. The strange accounts of gods sleeping or becoming inactive for extended periods may describe what happened when food of life supplies ran critically low. Unable to function at full capacity without proper nutrition, the gods would have entered dormant states, waiting for resupply that might take centuries to arrive from distant Nibiru. The survival of specific knowledge and bloodlines through the flood suggests that some information was considered worth preserving at any cost. The training periods for priests handling sacred substances extended for years, suggesting complexity beyond simple ritual. The half-divine heroes of mythology, Gilgamesh and Hercules and others of mixed parentage, may have had partial access to the food of life through their divine parents. This would explain their extraordinary abilities and extended lifespans, while still leaving them mortal, dependent on substances they could not fully access or metabolize. Climate records show that the period following the Great Flood saw environmental instability that would have challenged any supply system. Ancient texts distinguish between ordinary offerings and special preparations that required different handling entirely. The sudden collapse of Bronze Age civilizations around 1200 BCE may have been connected to disruption in divine support systems. If the food of life supply chain failed catastrophically, the gods who had maintained order and provided guidance would have been unable to prevent the cascade of disasters that followed their weakening. The transition from temple-based to text-based religion coincides with the disappearance of claims about direct divine presence. The geographic distribution of certain ritual practices follows patterns that suggest diffusion from specific centers. The emergence of monotheism may represent a theological response to the departure of most gods, a reshaping of tradition around whatever divine presence remained accessible. One god becomes more plausible when the many gods have left, when the temples stand empty and the old rituals no longer produce results. Early Christian debates about the Eucharist reveal uncertainty about whether divine food was symbolic or actual transformation. Linguistic analysis of divine food terminology reveals roots in practical vocabulary rather than abstract religious concepts. The mystery of why ancient peoples built such massive monuments, expending resources that seem disproportionate to any practical purpose, makes more sense if the monuments served divine needs we do not recognize. Perhaps size mattered for reasons related to the food of life, scale serving functions that smaller structures could not fulfill. The development of elaborate fasting traditions may represent inversion of feeding practices that no longer produced results. The decline of certain practices correlates with periods when historical records mention divine absence or silence. The universal pattern of sacrifice, offering the best to the gods before humans could partake, follows logically from a relationship where divine beings had first claim on essential resources. Sacrifice was not primitive superstition, but practical acknowledgement of dependency. The gods ate first because they had to eat first. Mystery religions promised initiates divine knowledge that may have included fragments of food of life traditions. Modern pharmaceutical research has validated some traditional preparations that were previously dismissed as superstition. The Golden Age myths found across cultures, memories of a time when gods walked among humans and life was easier, may describe the period when food of life supplies were abundant and the gods were generous. As supplies diminished and gods became more desperate, the Golden Age would have ended and the relationship would have soured. The Gnostic rejection of material creation may reflect disappointment at divine absence following withdrawal of sustenance support. The emphasis on purity in handling sacred substances parallels modern cleanroom protocols for sensitive materials. The oracular traditions, where humans sought divine guidance through cryptic messages, may represent degraded communication as gods became less accessible. Full presence became occasional visitation, became rare appearance, became voice alone, became symbolic interpretation. The progression tracks declining divine capacity. Hermetic traditions claiming Egyptian origins may preserve alchemical knowledge derived from actual food of life preparation. Archaeological stratigraphy shows changes in ritual practice that coincide with proposed dates of divine withdrawal. The association of certain metals with specific gods may reflect which gods controlled access to which components of the food of life. If different metals serve different purposes in the divine diet, gods would have specialized in particular substances, their identities becoming linked with the materials they controlled and consumed. The Kabbalistic concept of divine sparks trapped in matter may echo memories of sacred substances distributed throughout creation. The mathematical relationships encoded in temple architecture may have served purposes related to divine sustenance. The persistent search for immortality in human culture, from Gilgamesh to modern transhumanism, may be driven by genetic memory of what was possible when the food of life was available. We seek what we were designed to have, but were denied, driven by programming we cannot override toward goals we cannot fully achieve. Islamic traditions of honey and milk in paradise may preserve Mesopotamian concepts filtered through later religious development. Astronomical alignments in sacred buildings suggest timing requirements that go beyond mere symbolic orientation. The peculiar importance of blood in religious traditions as life force and sacred substance may connect to the role of blood in processing or distributing the food of life. If divine sustenance moved through the body in blood, blood itself would be sacred. The prohibition against consuming blood may protect divine secrets. Buddhist concepts of celestial nourishment in the higher realms parallel ancient Near Eastern divine food traditions. The hoarding behavior described in ancient economic texts suggests scarcity of substances whose nature remains unclear. The development of medicine and healing traditions may have originated from divine knowledge about the food of life and its effects on biology. The gods would have understood bodies and their functions at levels we are only beginning to approach. Medical knowledge may be degraded divine science. The Protestant rejection of transubstantiation may represent final severance from physical, divine feeding concepts. Trade networks in the ancient world included routes specifically designated for materials the texts call divine. The strange emphasis on purity in ancient religions, elaborate rituals of cleansing and avoiding contamination, may have served practical purposes related to food of life preparation. If contamination could spoil the divine sustenance, purity would be essential. The rituals persisted after the reasons were forgotten. The secrecy surrounding certain preparations mirrors modern protocols for controlled substances and classified technologies. These textual details resist purely symbolic interpretation and suggest underlying realities that scribes attempted to describe. The architecture of ancient temples, with their precise orientations and carefully calculated proportions, may have served purposes related to food of life storage or preparation. Buildings designed to meet divine needs would have required specifications that purely human purposes would not demand. Initiatory traditions that promise immortality may preserve fragments of knowledge about the food of life. The convergence of multiple lines of evidence strengthens the case that something historically real underlies these traditions. The recurring motif of divine twins or opposing gods may reflect real divisions among the Anunnaki over food of life policy. Some may have favored sharing with humans, while others insisted on strict separation. The conflicts between divine siblings in mythology may preserve memory of actual disagreements. The transformation of alchemical pursuits over time shows gradual loss of original understanding and purpose. Careful analysis of ancient terminology reveals distinctions that would be unnecessary if the concepts were purely metaphorical. The transformation of rivers into sacred entities, the Nile and Tigris and Ganges and others, may reflect their role in food of life production or distribution. Water was necessary for processing, for cultivation, for transport. The rivers that served divine needs became divine themselves in human memory. Medical traditions that emerged from temple practices may carry traces of divine nutritional knowledge. The practical specifications preserved in ritual texts suggest procedures developed through trial and error over extended periods. The persistence of ancestor worship in many cultures may derive from the belief that the dead could access divine realms and perhaps the food of life itself. If the ancestors had joined the gods, they might be able to intercede for the living, to share what they had gained in death. The distinction between sacred and profane food in ancient cultures may originate in actual differences that mattered. Cross-referencing accounts from different archives reveals consistent details that independent invention could not easily produce. The development of astronomy as the first precision science may have been driven by the need to track celestial events relevant to food of life production or delivery. If Nibiru's approach brought supplies, its position would need to be known. Stars mattered because survival mattered. Burial practices that provision the dead suggest beliefs derived from observation of beings who required physical sustenance. The emotional tone of certain passages suggests authors describing observed phenomena rather than inventing religious narratives. The strange authority granted to kings in ancient societies, treated as more than human yet less than divine, may reflect an intermediate status in the food of life hierarchy. Kings may have had limited access to divine sustenance, enough to distinguish them from ordinary mortals, but not enough to make them fully immortal. The decline of oracle traditions correlates with proposed dates when divine presence diminished significantly. Architectural features of ancient temples that seem functionally unnecessary may have served purposes we no longer recognize. The elaborate bureaucracies of ancient empires, with their obsessive record-keeping and hierarchical organization, may have originated in systems for managing food of life distribution. Administrative techniques developed for divine logistics would have been applied to human governance as divine needs faded. Prophetic literature's descriptions of future abundance may reflect hopes for restoration of what was lost. The resources invested in certain practices far exceeded what purely symbolic purposes would have justified economically. The consistent pattern of gods requiring temples to be maintained and offerings to be continued without interruption may reflect genuine need rather than mere vanity. If the temple system supplied what gods required to survive, any interruption would be dangerous. The gods demanded continuous service because continuous service kept them alive. The emphasis on specific bloodlines in ancient traditions may relate to capacity to process divine sustenance. Transmission patterns for this knowledge follow routes that suggest careful protection of valuable, practical information. The mystery teachings passed down through initiatory traditions across the Mediterranean world may have preserved fragments of food of life knowledge in coded form. The grades of initiation represented levels of understanding, with the highest truths revealed only to those who had proven their worthiness and discretion through years of preparation and testing. Festival calendars, organized around harvest and astronomical events, may preserve divine scheduling requirements. The vocabulary used for these concepts shows specialized development that parallels technical terminology in other fields. The transformation of temples into museums and archaeological sites represents the final stage of a process that began with divine departure. What were once living centers of cosmic activity have become monuments to absence, preserved not for worship, but for study. We examine the shells of systems we no longer understand. The elaborate security around certain temple precincts suggests protection of more than purely symbolic treasures. Administrative records treating these matters with extreme seriousness suggest consequences beyond purely religious concerns. The questions raised by the food of life concept cannot be definitively answered with current knowledge, but they deserve serious consideration rather than dismissal. If the gods were physical beings with physical needs, everything we think we know about ancient religion requires re-evaluation. The implications extend far beyond historical curiosity. Ancient prohibitions against mixing certain substances may derive from knowledge of dangerous interactions. The survival of certain practices in isolated traditions may preserve knowledge that mainstream religions transformed beyond recognition. Modern science approaches the question of immortality from directions the ancients could not have imagined. Yet the goal remains the same. Whether through pharmaceutical intervention, genetic modification, or technological enhancement, we pursue what the food of life supposedly provided. The quest has changed form, but not essence. The transformation of divine beings into abstract concepts follows patterns that suggest response to absence rather than philosophical development. Geographic patterns in the distribution of these concepts suggest diffusion from specific centers of origin and knowledge. Perhaps somewhere in the accumulated wisdom of humanity, the knowledge of the food of life survives in a form we have not recognized. Perhaps it awaits rediscovery by those who approach ancient traditions with appropriate respect and scientific rigor. Perhaps the gods left more than they intended when they departed. Traditional medicines derived from temple practices occasionally show efficacy that suggests preserved knowledge. The precision of certain ancient measurements implies purposes beyond what approximate values would have satisfied. The mystery of why certain substances became sacred across all human cultures may trace back to their role in food of life preparation. Salt, honey, wine, incense, all have associations with divine presence that purely symbolic explanations cannot fully account for. These substances may have been components of formulas that the gods required, their sacredness deriving from genuine practical importance. The persistence of gold in funeral practices across cultures may reflect beliefs derived from divine example. The legends of fountains of youth and waters of immortality that appear in folklore worldwide may preserve degraded memory of the water of life that the Sumerian texts describe explicitly. Explorers who sought these fountains in the physical world were looking for something real, something their traditions told them had once existed and might still be found. Sacred geography that identifies specific locations as divine may preserve memory of actual sites of significance. Changes in practice over time follow patterns consistent with gradual loss of understanding, rather than religious evolution alone. The elaborate embalming practices of ancient Egypt, preserving bodies for eternity through chemical processes we still do not fully understand, may have been attempts to achieve through technology what the food of life provided naturally. If the gods maintained their bodies through consumption, Humans would try to maintain their bodies through preservation, hoping to achieve similar results. The astronomical precision required for certain rituals suggests purposes beyond mere symbolic observation. Perhaps this is the deepest secret hidden in the oldest texts. The gods needed us more than we needed them. Their power was real, their knowledge vast, their technology beyond anything we have achieved. But their survival depended on what we could provide through endless labor. We were not merely servants, but lifelines. The relationship was not worship, but symbiosis. And when the symbiosis ended, when the needs could no longer be met, the gods departed and left us to find meaning on our own. Ancient texts that describe divine decline or aging may reflect actual observations of beings without sustenance. This has been the story of the Anunnaki food of life, the divine dependency that may have shaped human history from its earliest beginnings. We have traced evidence through Sumerian tablets, through parallel myths across continents, through the persistent connection of gold to immortality in every tradition. The questions raised tonight resist certain answers, but they deserve to be asked. What did the gods truly eat, and why could they never produce it on our world? The competitive nature of divine relationships in mythology may reflect resource conflicts over scarce sustenance. As the night deepens and sleep draws near, let these ancient mysteries accompany you toward rest without demanding resolution. The gods who created us may have been more vulnerable than any scripture admits, dependent on substances and supply chains that even their power could not guarantee forever. We were their solution, created to serve needs we barely understand even now. The temples are empty, the gods withdrawn, but the questions remain for those who still wonder. Temple destruction was considered catastrophic because it interrupted more than symbolic worship practices. Good night. Sleep well. Let the mystery of divine hunger rest in your dreams. When you wake, the ancient texts will still hold their secrets. The questions will still wait for answers, and the food of life will remain what it has been since the gods departed. A mystery at the heart of human origins, hinting at truths we may never fully recover. The gods are gone, but the hunger that brought them here still echoes in the stories they left behind for us to ponder. The emphasis on continuity in religious traditions may stem from requirements that gaps in practice would violate.